The notification email arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks before my dissertation defense. Congratulations, Dr. Martinez. Your doctoral committee has unanimously approved your dissertation. You are clear to proceed with your final defense. I read it twice, then set my phone down on the cramped desk of my studio apartment near the Arizona State University campus. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6 years. 6 years of 18-hour days, of choosing textbooks over groceries, of working double shifts at Desert Grounds Coffee Shop just to pay for research materials. 6 years of my family asking when I was going to get a real job and stop playing school. The silence in my tiny apartment felt different that night, like it was finally mine to keep. My dissertation on innovative teaching methods for dyslexic students had been inspired by my own struggles with reading comprehension as a child. While other kids breezed through chapter books, I fought through every sentence, every paragraph, a small war against letters that seemed to dance on the page. My parents had dismissed it as laziness. Sarah just needs to try harder, my mother Linda would tell teachers during parent conferences. She's probably just seeking attention. They never sought testing, never considered accommodations. I learned to adapt in silence, developing strategies that would later become the foundation of my research. Now, at 28, I held the proof that those struggles had led somewhere meaningful. The morning after that email, I called my parents to share the news. I'd been living on my own since undergraduate school, supporting myself through a combination of teaching assistant stipends, barista wages, and the occasional freelance tutoring gig. My studio apartment wasn't much to look at, furnished mostly with hand-me-downs and library book sale finds, but it had been my sanctuary throughout this long academic journey. I kept my textbooks stacked neatly on makeshift shelves made from cinder blocks and wooden planks, my laptop balanced on a small desk I'd rescued from a yard sale and refinished myself. When my father Robert answered the phone, his voice carried that familiar tone of mild irritation, like I was interrupting something important. "Sarah, what's going on? It's early." I could hear the sounds of his auto repair shop in the background, the hiss of air tools and the murmur of morning customers. He'd owned Martinez Auto Care for 15 years, building it from a single bay operation into something respectable in their Scottsdale neighborhood. It was honest work, he'd always emphasized, unlike my expensive hobby of graduate school. "Dad, I wanted to share some good news," I said, trying to keep the excitement contained in my voice. "My dissertation committee approved my research. I'm cleared for my final defense next month." There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then he sighed, the kind of heavy exhale that had punctuated most of our conversations about my education for the past 6 years. "That's nice, Sarah, but when are you going to finish up with all this and get a proper job? Your mother and I have been talking, and we think it's time you started contributing to the family instead of just taking." The words hit me like a physical weight. Taking. As if the 3 jobs I'd worked simultaneously during my coursework, the sleepless nights writing and researching, the years of barely scraping by financially, somehow constituted taking from them. My mother Linda's voice joined the conversation, that practiced tone of patient disappointment she'd perfected over the years. "Honey, we know you've been working hard, but Jessica really needs our support right now. Her wellness coaching business is just starting to take off, and she could use some financial backing. We were hoping you might consider helping out since you'll presumably be making more money soon." Jessica, my younger sister by 3 years, who had moved back into our childhood bedroom 2 years ago after her boutique clothing line failed. Before that, it had been her beauty blog that couldn't generate enough revenue. Before that, a brief stint as a social media consultant that ended when her only client fired her for consistently missing deadlines. I looked around my tiny apartment, at the instant ramen packages stacked in my cupboard, at the space heater I'd been using all winter because I couldn't afford to keep the thermostat above 60 degrees. "Mom, I'm not making money yet. I still have to defend my dissertation, and then I'll be looking for academic positions, which don't exactly pay what you might think they do." The silence that followed was loaded with all the things they'd said before about my choices, about how I was wasting my life on theoretical nonsense while Jessica was trying to build something real. "We've supported you long enough," my father's voice cut through the quiet. It's time you started thinking about what you owe this family. Supported me. I thought about the undergraduate loans I was still paying off, the graduate school years funded entirely through my own work and merit-based aid. I thought about the times I'd asked for help, maybe $50 for textbooks or a small loan to cover rent, when my teaching stipend was delayed, always met with reminders about how they were focusing their resources on Jessica's opportunities right now. The conversation ended the way most of our recent talks had concluded, with them suggesting I reconsider my priorities, and me agreeing to think about what they'd said, just to end the uncomfortable tension. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the late nights I'd spent writing about educational psychology, about how children internalize messages about their worth and capabilities. Maybe it was the research I'd done on family systems and the ways that achievement can be weaponized. Or maybe it was simply that after 6 years of proving to myself that I could do this, I was tired of apologizing for succeeding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 2 weeks later, I received another phone call from my mother. This time, her tone was more direct, less patient. "Sarah, we need to talk. Can you come to the house this weekend?" I was in the middle of preparing for my dissertation defense, practicing my presentation in the mirror of my bathroom, the only space in my apartment, large enough to pace while I rehearsed. But something in her voice suggested this wasn't optional. Saturday afternoon, I drove my 12-year-old Honda Civic through the familiar streets of Scottsdale to the house where I'd grown up. It was a modest ranch-style home with a neat front yard, and my father's work truck parked in the driveway next to Jessica's newer model sedan, a graduation gift from 2 years ago when she'd finished her bachelor's degree in communications. I'd received a card and a gift certificate to a chain restaurant for my master's degree completion. Inside, the living room had been arranged like a family meeting. My parents sat on the couch, Jessica in the armchair, all of them wearing expressions that suggested they'd been discussing me before I arrived. The coffee table held what looked like printed documents, spread out like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was attending. "Sit down, honey," my mother said, gesturing to the remaining chair. "We've been doing some thinking about your situation." My situation. As if my doctoral work, my research, my impending defense were a problem that needed solving, rather than an achievement worth celebrating. My father leaned forward, his hands clasped together in the gesture he used when delivering what he considered important information. "Sarah, we've calculated what your education has cost this family over the years. Not just the direct support, but the opportunity costs. The times we couldn't help Jessica, because we were helping you. The family vacations we postponed. The investments we couldn't make." He gestured to the papers on the coffee table. "We think it's time you paid us back." I stared at the documents, trying to process what I was hearing. One sheet appeared to be a handwritten ledger, listing items like groceries provided during winter break visits and emergency dental work payment sophomore year. Another looked like a calculation of interest on what they considered loans rather than parental support. The numbers were surprisingly specific, surprisingly small, and surprisingly cruel. Jessica spoke for the first time since I'd arrived, her voice carrying that wounded tone she'd perfected as a child whenever she wanted something. "Sarah, you've always been selfish about your education. You act like you're so much better than us just because you read more books." She gestured around the living room as if it were evidence of something shameful. "Mom and Dad have given you everything, and you've never once offered to help me with my business ideas. You just judge me for trying different things." The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were moving closer together. These were the people who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped with elementary school science projects. But they were also the people who had consistently dismissed my learning differences, who had compared my struggles to Jessica's natural ease with social situations, who had made me feel like my achievements were somehow less valuable because they came through effort rather than intuition. My mother reached for a folder I hadn't noticed before. "We've been talking to your Aunt Carol, and she thinks you should consider using your future earning potential to help Jessica get her wellness coaching certification. It's only $8,000, and you'll presumably be making professor money soon." Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, who had opinions about everyone's life choices and shared them freely at family gatherings. Aunt Carol, who had told me at Jessica's high school graduation that I was making things too complicated by pursuing graduate school. I looked at the three of them, arranged against me in my childhood living room, and something shifted inside my chest. It wasn't anger exactly, though that was part of it. It was more like recognition, the way you might feel when you finally understand a puzzle you've been working on for years. This wasn't about money or support, or even Jessica's business ventures. This was about control, about keeping me small enough to fit into their understanding of how our family was supposed to work. "I'm not paying you back for raising me," I said quietly. "And I'm not funding Jessica's business." The words came out calmer than I felt, which seemed to surprise them more than if I had yelled. Jessica's eyes filled with tears immediately, the response that had always worked to shift attention back to her needs. "How can you be so cruel?" my mother asked, her voice breaking slightly. "After everything we've done for you?" But I was thinking about all the things they hadn't done. The learning assessment they'd refused to pursue. The college application fees I'd paid myself. The nights I'd worked closing shifts at desert grounds to pay for conference presentations of my research. The years of teaching myself that my struggles with traditional learning didn't make me stupid, just different. My father's face hardened in the way it did when he felt his authority being challenged. "You have a moral obligation to this family, Sarah. We invested in you, and investments are supposed to pay returns." He picked up one of the papers from the coffee table, a printout of my university's website showing average starting salaries for educational psychology professors. "You're going to be making good money. Jessica needs help now." I stood up slowly, looking around the room one more time. The family photos on the mantel showed a progression of birthdays and holidays, Jessica always centered in the frame, me usually slightly to the side or partially obscured by someone else. Even in our family pictures, I had learned to take up less space. "I'm going to finish my dissertation defense," I said. "I'm going to graduate with my PhD, and I'm going to build a career helping kids who struggle the way I did." I moved toward the door, but Jessica's voice stopped me. "You think you're so smart?" she said, her tears turning to anger now that the sympathy approach wasn't working. "But you're just wasting your life on something nobody cares about. Teaching methods for dyslexic kids? Who's going to pay you for that? You're going to end up broke and alone, and we won't be here to help you then." I turned back to look at her, sitting in the chair where she'd spent most of her adult life, waiting for the next opportunity to be handed to her. "Maybe," I said, "but at least I'll be broke and alone with a doctorate I earned myself." The drive back to my apartment felt longer than usual, the familiar streets of Phoenix blurring past as I tried to process what had just happened. In my studio, I sat on my second-hand couch and looked at the stack of research books that had been my constant companions for 6 years. Tomorrow, I would continue preparing for my defense. Next month, I would stand in front of my committee and present the work that had consumed my life. And after that, I would begin the job search that would hopefully lead to a position where I could implement the teaching strategies I'd developed. But tonight, I felt the weight of understanding that the family I'd been trying to make proud might never see my achievements as anything more than a betrayal of what they thought I owed them. The silence in my apartment felt different now, not peaceful like it had the night I received my committee's approval, but hollow. I had worked so hard to become someone who could help kids, like I had been. Kids whose learning differences made them feel broken in traditional classroom settings. Now I wondered if my own family saw my success as just another way I had failed to be who they wanted me to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Mom is crying. I hope you're happy." Below that, another message. "We're family. Family is supposed to stick together." I set the phone aside without responding and opened my laptop to review my dissertation presentation one more time. In 3 weeks, I would defend 6 years of research about how children's self-concept develops in response to academic challenges. I wondered if my committee would see the irony in my personal situation, how the girl who had struggled with reading had grown up to study ways to help other struggling readers, only to have her own family question the value of that work. The next morning brought another text from my mother. "We love you, Sarah. We just want what's best for the family." Followed by, "Jessica found a new business opportunity. Organic skincare line. She just needs startup capital." I deleted both messages without reading them completely and walked to campus for my regular meeting with my dissertation advisor, Dr. Patricia Chen. Dr. Chen had been my academic mentor throughout graduate school, a woman in her 50s who had built her career studying educational interventions for students with learning differences. She'd taken an interest in my work partly because of my personal experience with learning challenges, but mostly because my research showed genuine promise for helping teachers adapt their methods to reach struggling students more effectively. "You look tired," she observed as I settled into the chair across from her desk. Her office was everything I hoped my own would be someday, lined with books, filled with plants, organized but lived in, a space where thinking happened. "Are you ready for next week's defense?" I was ready academically. My presentation was polished, my research solid, my conclusions well supported by data. But the conversation with my family had left me feeling unmoored in a way I hadn't expected. "Dr. Chen," I said carefully, "did your family understand what you were doing when you were in graduate school?" She smiled, the kind of expression that suggested she'd been asked this question before. "My parents wanted me to be a medical doctor. They thought educational research was too abstract, too removed from helping real people. It took them years to understand that teaching teachers how to reach struggling students was its own form of healing." She leaned back in her chair, studying my face. "Are you having family pressure about your career path?" I told her about the conversation, about the ledger of perceived debts, about Jessica's business ventures, and the expectation that I should fund them. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah," she said finally, "your research is going to help thousands of children over the course of your career, kids who might otherwise struggle in silence the way you did. That's not a luxury or a hobby. That's essential work." She gestured to a framed photo on her desk showing her with a group of teachers at a professional development workshop. "The methods you've developed for multisensory reading instruction are already being implemented in 3 school districts. You're not taking from your family by pursuing this work. You're giving to countless families whose children will benefit from what you've learned." Walking home from campus that afternoon, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for weeks. My family's inability to see the value in my work didn't diminish that value. Their expectation that I should prioritize Jessica's undefined business ventures over my own carefully researched career didn't make their expectation reasonable. I had spent 6 years becoming an expert in something that mattered, and I didn't owe anyone an apology for that achievement. But I also knew that this conflict wasn't going to resolve itself through understanding or compromise. My family had made their position clear. My success was selfish unless it served their immediate financial needs. My education was a debt I owed, rather than an accomplishment I had earned. And Jessica's struggles to find her path were somehow my responsibility to solve, rather than her own challenge to meet. That evening, I called my grandfather Frank, my mother's father, who lived in a senior community about 20 minutes from my apartment. Grandpa Frank had always been different from the rest of my family. Quieter but more observant. Less likely to offer unsolicited advice but more likely to listen when you needed to talk. He'd been a high school English teacher for 37 years before retiring, and he was the only family member who had ever asked detailed questions about my research. "Grandpa," I said when he answered, "can I come visit you tonight? I need to talk to someone." His apartment in the senior community was small but organized, filled with books, and the kind of comfortable furniture that invites long conversations. He made tea and settled into his favorite armchair while I explained the situation with my parents and Jessica. "Your grandmother would have been proud of you," he said when I finished. "She always said you had a special way of understanding things that others missed." He was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the desert landscape beyond the community grounds. "Your mother was always jealous of how easily learning came to you, even when it didn't come easily. She struggled in school, and I think she never forgave herself for not being academic. Now she sees your success as a reminder of her own limitations." I hadn't known that about my mother's school experience. She'd always presented herself as someone who had chosen practical paths over academic ones, not someone who had struggled with learning. She never told me she had trouble in school. "People don't always share their vulnerabilities," Grandpa Frank said, "especially when they're ashamed of them. Your mother sees Jessica as a second chance to prove that her family can succeed in ways she couldn't. And she sees your success as evidence that maybe she could have done more if she'd tried harder." He set down his teacup and looked at me directly. None of that is your fault, Sarah. And none of it makes their demands on you reasonable. We talked until almost 10 o'clock. About my research. About the defense next week. About the job applications I'd submitted to universities across the country. When I left his apartment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Clarity about my own path forward, regardless of my family's approval or understanding. The next few days passed in a blur of final preparation. I practiced my presentation until I could deliver it smoothly even when distracted, reviewed potential committee questions until I felt confident in my responses, and tried to ignore the increasingly frequent texts from my mother asking when I was going to make things right with the family. Then, 5 days before my scheduled defense, something unexpected happened that would change everything. 5 days before my scheduled defense, I received a call from Dr. Chen that made my hands shake as I held the phone. Sarah, I have some incredible news. The Journal of Educational Psychology wants to fast-track publication of your research. They're calling it groundbreaking. Her voice carried an excitement I'd rarely heard from my typically composed advisor. They want to feature it as the lead article in their fall issue, and they're requesting an extended interview about your methodology. I sat down heavily on my second-hand couch, trying to process what she was telling me. The Journal of Educational Psychology was the most prestigious publication in my field, the kind of journal that established careers and influenced policy. My research on multisensory teaching methods for dyslexic students had been accepted not just for publication, but for prominence in a way that would make me visible to educators and researchers across the country. There's more, Dr. Chen continued. The National Education Association wants to discuss implementing pilot programs based on your findings in 5 major urban school districts. Sarah, this isn't just academic recognition. This is real-world impact on a scale most doctoral students only dream about. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my family questioned the value of my work, demanding I abandon it to fund Jessica's latest entrepreneurial whim, the academic community was recognizing it as significant enough to influence educational policy nationwide. I thought about all those nights I'd fallen asleep over research papers, fueled by instant coffee, and the stubborn belief that my learning differences might actually be the key to helping other struggling students. That evening, I called my parents to share the news. Maybe, I thought, this external validation would help them understand what I'd been working toward all these years. Maybe prestigious journal publication and national education initiatives would translate into something they could respect, even if they couldn't fully comprehend the academic process that had led to this moment. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice carrying that familiar tone of impatience that suggested I was interrupting something more important. Sarah, I hope you're calling because you've reconsidered our conversation. Jessica found a new business mentor, and she needs the consultation fee by Friday. Before I could respond, she continued, your Aunt Carol thinks we've been too lenient with you. She says we should have insisted on payback agreements before supporting your education. I took a deep breath, trying to hold on to the joy I'd felt when Dr. Chen called. Mom, I have some exciting news to share. My dissertation research is being published in the top journal in my field, and the National Education Association wants to implement my teaching methods in school districts across the country. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd heard me. That's nice, dear, she said finally, her tone suggesting it was anything but nice to her. But publications don't pay the bills, do they? Jessica needs real money for real opportunities, not theoretical recognition that doesn't help our family. I could hear Jessica's voice in the background, asking if I had come to my senses about funding her consultation fee. My father's voice joined the conversation, that gravelly tone he used when he was trying to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. Sarah, we're proud that you're getting published, we really are. But pride doesn't help Jessica launch her organic skincare line. We've already told people in the neighborhood that our successful daughter is going to help get the family business off the ground. Don't make us look foolish. The family business. Jessica's undefined skincare venture had apparently become a family enterprise in the few days since I'd last spoken to them. I wondered who these neighbors were who had been promised my financial support, who had been told that my doctorate was primarily valuable for its earning potential rather than its contribution to educational research. I haven't agreed to fund anything, I said carefully. I'm focused on my defense next week, and on building my own career. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like I was speaking a foreign language they couldn't understand. For so many years, I had automatically considered their needs before my own, had internalized the message that my achievements only mattered if they benefited the family in tangible ways. Jessica's voice became clearer as she apparently took the phone from our mother. "Sarah, you're being incredibly selfish. I've been working on this business plan for weeks, and I have a real chance to make something of myself. But I need startup capital, and you're the only one in the family who's going to have money soon." Her voice took on that pleading quality that had always been effective in getting what she wanted. "I've already told my business mentor that my sister was going to invest. Don't humiliate me by backing out now." I found myself staring at my reflection in the black screen of my laptop, seeing a woman who had spent 6 years becoming an expert in educational psychology, who had developed teaching methods that would help thousands of children, who had earned recognition from the most respected publication in her field. But in my family's eyes, I was still just a potential source of funding for Jessica's dreams, a supporting character in someone else's story. The conversation ended with my mother's familiar refrain about family obligations and my promise to think about what they'd said, but this time the words felt hollow, even as I spoke them. After hanging up, I sat in my tiny apartment surrounded by the evidence of my academic journey. Books and research papers and presentation materials that represented thousands of hours of focused work. The disconnection between my family's perception of my life and the reality of what I'd accomplished felt like a chasm I couldn't bridge. The next morning brought a text from Jessica that made my stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "Mom and Dad are really hurt. We thought you cared about family. Guess we were wrong." Followed by another message an hour later. "My business mentor says family investors are the most reliable. Don't you want to see me succeed?" I was sitting in desert grounds during my morning shift, grinding coffee beans and trying to focus on the mechanical rhythm of work rather than the emotional turmoil of my family's situation. My coworker Miguel, a graduate student in social work who'd become a friend over the past 2 years, noticed my distraction as I nearly overfilled a customer's cup for the 3rd time that morning. "You okay, Sarah? You seem like you're somewhere else today." Miguel had heard enough about my family dynamics during our shared shifts that he understood the complexity of my situation. He was the only person I'd told about my family's financial demands, partly because his own experience with family pressure around career choices made him a sympathetic listener. "They want me to fund my sister's business instead of pursuing academic positions," I said quietly as we worked through the morning rush. "They think my PhD is only valuable if it generates money I can share with them." Speaking the words out loud to someone outside my family made the situation sound even more unreasonable than it felt from the inside. Miguel shook his head as he steamed milk for a latte, his expression reflecting the disbelief I couldn't quite access myself. "Sarah, you've spent 6 years developing research that's going to help kids who struggle in school. That's not selfish. That's the opposite of selfish." He handed the finished drink to a waiting customer before continuing. "Your family is asking you to abandon work that will benefit thousands of children so you can fund a skincare business. Do you hear how backward that is?" His perspective helped me see my situation more clearly, but it also highlighted how isolated I'd become within my own family. The people who should have been celebrating my achievements were instead treating them as obstacles to Jessica's entrepreneurial ambitions. The work that was gaining national recognition was being dismissed as impractical dreaming that interfered with real family responsibilities. That afternoon, I received an email that shifted my understanding of my situation even further. Dr. Chen had forwarded me a message from Dr. Rebecca Williams, the chair of the education department at Northern Arizona University, who had read my published research and wanted to discuss a potential faculty position. The message was brief but promising. "Dr. Martinez, your work on multisensory learning interventions aligns perfectly with our department's mission. Would you be interested in discussing a tenure-track position? We're particularly impressed by the practical applications of your research." A tenure-track position. The kind of opportunity that represented the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. A chance to continue my research while teaching the next generation of educators. I read the email 3 times, trying to internalize that someone in my field saw my work as valuable enough to offer me a career path that would allow me to keep developing innovative teaching methods. When I called Dr. Chen to discuss the opportunity, her enthusiasm was infectious. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of position your research has prepared you for. NAU has one of the strongest special education programs in the Southwest, and they're looking for someone who can bridge the gap between research and practice. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. The salary isn't enormous, but it's enough to live comfortably while pursuing the work you're passionate about. After our conversation, I sat in my car outside Desert Grounds, looking at the email from Dr. Williams and thinking about the choice I was facing. I could pursue this academic opportunity, build a career around research that would help struggling students, and continue working toward expertise in a field that desperately needed innovative approaches. Or I could abandon my professional goals to fund Jessica's business ventures, becoming the family financier my parents seemed to think I owed them. The choice should have been obvious, but family pressure has a way of making clear decisions feel complicated. I thought about Jessica's tears, about my mother's disappointment, about the neighborhood friends who had been promised that the family's educated daughter would solve everyone's financial problems. I thought about Aunt Carol's opinions and Uncle Mike's judgments, and all the family gatherings where my academic achievements had been treated as interesting, but ultimately impractical compared to Jessica's real-world business ideas. Then I thought about the children I'd worked with during my research, kids whose learning differences made traditional classroom instruction nearly impossible to follow. I remembered Marcus, an 8-year-old who had been labeled lazy by his teachers, until we implemented visual learning strategies that helped him excel in reading comprehension. I thought about Elena, whose dyslexia had convinced her she was stupid until multisensory phonics instruction revealed her quick intelligence. These were the students my research could help, the children whose educational experience could be transformed by the teaching methods I'd developed. That evening, I drove to Grandpa Frank's apartment to discuss the faculty position opportunity. His small living room felt like a refuge from the emotional chaos my family had created around my career choices. He listened carefully as I described Dr. Williams's offer, asking thoughtful questions about the research opportunities and teaching responsibilities the position would involve. "Your grandmother always said you had a gift for understanding how people learn differently," he said when I finished explaining the opportunity. "She would have been so proud to see you using that gift to help other children." He reached for a photo album I'd never seen before, filled with pictures from my childhood that focused on moments I'd forgotten. Me reading to younger cousins, helping neighborhood kids with homework, explaining math concepts using manipulatives I'd created from household objects. "You are always teaching," he said, pointing to a picture of 10-year-old me showing my cousin Brian how to build a model airplane. "Even when you were struggling in school yourself, you found ways to help other kids understand things that were difficult for them." The photos revealed a pattern I hadn't recognized, a lifetime of instinctively adapting explanations and methods to reach different types of learners. "Grandpa," I said carefully, "do you think I'm being selfish by not helping Jessica with her business?" The question had been nagging at me despite Miguel's reassurances and Dr. Chen's enthusiasm about my career prospects. Family loyalty was a value that had been emphasized throughout my childhood, and choosing my own professional goals over Jessica's financial needs felt like a betrayal of that principle. He was quiet for a long moment, looking through the photo album at pictures that spanned my childhood and adolescence. "Sarah," he said finally, "helping your sister would mean giving up work that will help hundreds of children learn more effectively. That's not selfish. That's the opposite of selfish." He closed the album and looked at me directly. "Your parents have confused enabling Jessica's avoidance of responsibility with family loyalty. Those aren't the same thing." His words helped clarify something I'd been struggling to articulate. Supporting Jessica's business ventures wouldn't just mean sacrificing my own career goals. It would mean allowing her to continue avoiding the kind of sustained effort and skill development that real business success required. My parents' financial rescues had never helped her build genuine competence or resilience, just dependence on external solutions to internal challenges. The weekend before my dissertation defense, my family dynamics reached a new level of intensity that I hadn't anticipated. Jessica called me Saturday morning, her voice oscillating between tears and anger in a way that triggered all my childhood responses to her emotional distress. "Sarah, I can't believe you're doing this to me. I finally found something I'm passionate about, and you're sabotaging it because you're jealous of my creativity." Jealous of her creativity? I looked around my apartment at the evidence of 6 years of creative problem solving, innovative research design, and original thinking about educational challenges. My dissertation represented the kind of sustained creative work that had required me to develop entirely new approaches to teaching methods, to synthesize research from multiple fields, to imagine solutions that didn't previously exist. Jessica, I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm pursuing my own career in educational research. The words felt inadequate to explain the complexity of what I'd been working toward, the significance of the recognition my work was receiving, the potential impact of implementing my teaching methods in schools across the country. Educational research, she repeated, her tone making it sound like a frivolous hobby. Sarah, you're going to spend your life in classrooms making barely enough money to survive, while I could be building a business that generates real wealth for our whole family. The conversation revealed how completely she misunderstood both the nature of my work and its potential for financial stability. But more importantly, it showed how she viewed my professional goals as somehow inferior to her entrepreneurial ambitions. My mother's voice joined the call, that familiar tone of patient disappointment that had shaped so many of our family interactions. Sarah, honey, we're not asking you to give up your education. We just want you to use it responsibly to help your family. The implication that pursuing my own career path was irresponsible felt like a distortion of reality so complete that I struggled to respond. I am using my education responsibly, I said finally. I'm using it to develop teaching methods that will help children with learning differences succeed in school. But even as I spoke, I could sense that my family heard these words as excuses, rather than explanations. Justifications for selfishness rather than descriptions of meaningful work. The call ended with Jessica's promise to never forgive me if I destroy her chance at success, and my mother's reminder that family comes first, always. After hanging up, I sat in my quiet apartment trying to reconcile the person I'd become through 6 years of graduate study with the person my family seemed to see when they looked at me. Monday morning arrived with unexpected complications that made my family situation feel even more surreal. I received a text from my Aunt Carol. Your mother tells me you're refusing to help Jessica. Very disappointed in your attitude. Family should stick together. This was followed by a message from my cousin Brian. Heard you got too good for the family. Jessica really needs this support. The speed with which family members who rarely contacted me had suddenly developed opinions about my career choices suggested that my parents had been actively campaigning for their position, framing my pursuit of academic work as a betrayal of family values rather than a legitimate professional choice. I wondered what version of events they had shared, how they had explained my research and its potential impact, whether they had mentioned the national recognition my work was receiving. That afternoon, I met with Dr. Chen for what would be our final preparation session before my defense. Her office felt like a sanctuary from the emotional turbulence my family was creating around what should have been the most exciting week of my academic career. She noticed immediately that something was affecting my focus. Sarah, you seem distracted today. Are you nervous about Thursday's defense? Her concern was genuine, reflecting the mentoring relationship we'd built over the past 3 years. Dr. Chen had invested significant time and energy in helping me develop my research, and my success reflected well on her guidance as much as my own efforts. I found myself explaining the full scope of my family situation, including their demands for financial support and their dismissal of my academic achievements as impractical selfishness. Dr. Chen listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious as I described the pressure I was facing to abandon my career goals in favor of funding Jessica's business ventures. Sarah, she said when I finished, what you're describing isn't normal family support dynamics. This is financial manipulation disguised as family loyalty. She pulled out a notebook and began writing as she spoke. Your research is going to influence educational policy at the national level. The teaching methods you've developed will help thousands of children over the course of your career. That's not selfish. That's public service. Her perspective helped me see my situation more clearly, but it also highlighted how completely my family misunderstood the nature and value of academic work. They saw my PhD as primarily valuable for its earning potential rather than its contribution to knowledge and practice in education. They viewed my research as a lengthy detour from real work rather than as real work itself. There's something else you should know, Dr. Chen continued, consulting her notes. The pilot program implementation I mentioned last week has expanded. The National Education Association now wants to test your methods in 15 school districts across 7 states. Sarah, this represents the largest implementation of new learning difference interventions in over a decade. 15 school districts, 7 states. Thousands of children who might benefit from teaching approaches I had developed during late nights in my tiny apartment. Funded by barista wages, and sustained by the belief that my own learning struggles could inform solutions for other struggling students. The scale of potential impact made my family's focus on Jessica's skincare business feel not just misguided, but actively harmful to work that could benefit countless children. Wednesday evening, less than 24 hours before my dissertation defense, my family's situation reached a crisis point that I hadn't anticipated. My mother called with news that made my preparation for the defense seem suddenly less important than I'd believed it was. "Sarah, we need to talk. Can you come to the house tonight? It's important." Her tone carried a seriousness that suggested something beyond their usual financial demands and guilt-based manipulation. Against my better judgment, worried that someone might be ill or facing a genuine emergency, I drove to their Scottsdale home for what I assumed would be a brief conversation. The scene that greeted me in their living room was more elaborate than anything I'd experienced during our previous conflicts. Jessica sat at the dining room table surrounded by printed documents, my parents flanked her on either side, and Aunt Carol occupied the chair usually reserved for guests. The formal arrangement suggested they had prepared for this conversation, had planned whatever confrontation was about to unfold. "Sit down, Sarah," my father said, gesturing to the remaining chair like I was being called before a tribunal. "We've been doing some research about your situation." The documents on the table appeared to be printouts from university websites, salary information for education professors, and what looked like calculations of my potential future earnings. Jessica looked up from the papers with an expression of wounded betrayal that would have been convincing if I hadn't seen her practice it so many times throughout our childhood. "Sarah, I can't believe you've been lying to us about your finances. Do you know how much money you're going to be making as a professor?" She held up a printout showing salary ranges for tenure-track education faculty. "You could easily afford to help me get started, and you're pretending you can't." The numbers on the page represented starting salaries that were comfortable but hardly extravagant, especially considering the 6 years of minimal income I'd endured to reach this point. But more importantly, they represented income I hadn't earned yet, potential earnings from positions I hadn't secured, money that existed only in their projections of my future rather than in any current reality. My mother leaned forward with that expression of patient disappointment she'd perfected over the years. "Honey, we understand that you want your independence, but family has to come first sometimes. Jessica has a real opportunity here, and you have the ability to help her succeed." The word ability carried weight in her tone, as if having potential future earning capacity created immediate obligations to fund other people's dreams. Aunt Carol spoke for the first time since I'd arrived, her voice carrying the authority she'd always assumed in family discussions. "Sarah, I've been talking to your parents about this situation, and frankly, I'm appalled by your selfishness. Your sister needs help, and you're choosing books over family. It's disgraceful." Her judgment felt particularly unfair coming from someone who had never shown interest in my education or career goals, who had consistently dismissed my achievements as impractical and self-indulgent. I looked around the table at these 4 people who had shaped my understanding of family loyalty and mutual support, trying to reconcile the people who had raised me with the people who were now demanding I sacrifice my career for Jessica's unproven business venture. The conversation felt surreal, like I was defending my right to pursue work that was gaining national recognition, while they treated it as a selfish hobby that interfered with real family responsibilities. "I'm defending my dissertation tomorrow," I said quietly. "My research is being implemented in school districts across the country. This isn't a hobby or a phase. This is my career, and it's going to help thousands of children learn more effectively." The words felt inadequate to convey the significance of what I'd accomplished, the years of work that had led to this moment, the potential impact of continuing to develop innovative teaching methods. Jessica's response revealed how completely she misunderstood the nature of academic work and its value beyond immediate financial returns. "Sarah, you're talking about helping imaginary children while ignoring your real sister who needs help right now. How is that not selfish?" Her question reframed my choice to pursue educational research as abandonment of family obligations. as if the children who would benefit from my teaching methods were somehow less deserving of consideration than her business aspirations. The meeting continued for another hour, with various family members taking turns explaining why my academic achievements created obligations to fund Jessica's entrepreneurial dreams, why my potential future earnings should be directed toward family financial goals rather than my own career development. By the time I left their house, I felt emotionally exhausted, in a way that made preparing for my dissertation defense feel like a secondary concern. But as I drove back to my apartment through the quiet Phoenix streets, something began to shift in my understanding of the situation. Tomorrow, I would stand before my dissertation committee and defend 6 years of research that was already being recognized as significant enough to influence national educational policy. My work was helping children who struggled the way I had struggled, providing teachers with tools to reach students who might otherwise be left behind by traditional instructional methods. My family's inability to see the value in that work, their insistence that it was less important than Jessica's undefined business plans, said more about their priorities than about the merit of my career choices. I had spent 6 years becoming an expert in something that mattered, developing solutions to real educational problems, earning recognition from the most respected institutions in my field. I didn't owe anyone an apology for that achievement, not even the people who had raised me. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment reviewing my dissertation presentation one final time, surrounded by the books and research papers that had been my constant companions throughout graduate school. Tomorrow, I would defend work that represented not just my academic accomplishments, but my contribution to solving real problems in education. Regardless of my family's understanding or approval, that work had value that extended far beyond their narrow conception of success and family obligation. The morning of my defense arrived gray and overcast, unusual for Phoenix in late spring. I dressed carefully in the one professional suit I owned, purchased 2 years ago for academic conferences with money I'd saved from extra tutoring sessions. As I drove to campus, my phone buzzed repeatedly with messages I chose not to read. Today was about 6 years of research, not family drama. The dissertation defense took place in a conference room I'd walked past hundreds of times during my graduate studies, never imagining I'd one day present my own research within its walls. My committee consisted of 5 faculty members, including Dr. Chen, and specialists in learning disabilities, educational psychology, and curriculum development. As I connected my laptop to the projector and arranged my notes, I felt the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you're prepared but understanding that everything you've worked for depends on the next 2 hours. "Good morning, everyone," Dr. Chen announced as the committee settled into their chairs. "We're here to evaluate Sarah Martinez's dissertation research on multisensory teaching methods for students with dyslexia. Sarah, you may begin whenever you're ready." The formal words marked the beginning of what felt like the most important presentation of my life. I began with the personal motivation that had driven my research, explaining how my own struggles with traditional reading instruction had led me to investigate alternative approaches that could reach students whose brains processed information differently. The committee listened attentively as I outlined the theoretical framework that had guided my study, the methodology I'd used to test innovative teaching techniques, and the results that had exceeded my expectations for effectiveness. The data shows significant improvement in reading comprehension among students who received multisensory instruction compared to the control group using traditional methods, I explained, clicking through slides that displayed charts and graphs representing months of careful data collection. More importantly, these improvements were sustained over the 6-month follow-up period, suggesting that the teaching methods create lasting changes in how students approach reading tasks. Dr. Williams, a committee member who specialized in learning disabilities research, leaned forward with interest. "Sarah, can you explain how your approach differs from existing multisensory programs?" Her question opened into a detailed discussion of the specific innovations I'd developed, the ways my methods integrated visual, auditory, and kinesthetic learning modalities more comprehensively than previous approaches. The questions continued for over an hour, covering everything from statistical analysis to practical implementation challenges. Each query demonstrated that my committee had read my research carefully, that they understood both its contributions and its limitations. As I responded to their concerns and clarified complex methodological decisions, I felt the confidence that comes from truly understanding your subject matter. One final question, said Dr. Rodriguez, the curriculum specialist on my committee. Where do you see this research leading in the next 5 years? I outlined my vision for expanding the teaching methods to address other learning differences, for training teachers to implement these approaches effectively, for conducting longitudinal studies to measure long-term impact on student outcomes. After nearly 2 hours of intensive questioning, Dr. Chen asked me to step outside while the committee deliberated. I stood in the hallway, looking out at the campus where I'd spent 6 years transforming from a struggling undergraduate into someone who had contributed new knowledge to educational research. Whatever happened in that conference room, I had completed something significant. 15 minutes later, Dr. Chen opened the door with a smile that told me everything before she spoke. Congratulations, Dr. Martinez. Your committee unanimously approves your dissertation. Welcome to the academic community. The words felt surreal even as I heard them, the culmination of everything I'd worked toward since deciding to pursue graduate study in educational psychology. The celebration that followed was small but meaningful. Dr. Chen had arranged for champagne and cookies in her office, where my committee gathered to offer congratulations and discuss my research's potential for publication and implementation. Dr. Williams mentioned the tenure-track position at Northern Arizona University again, emphasizing how well my work aligned with their department's goals. As I drove home from campus that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure joy in my own achievement, uncontaminated by family expectations or demands for justification. I was now Dr. Sarah Martinez, holder of a PhD in educational psychology, developer of teaching methods that would help struggling students across the country. The title felt both foreign and completely natural, like putting on clothes that fit perfectly after years of wearing things that were too small. My phone had accumulated dozens of messages during the defense, which I finally read when I reached my apartment. Most were congratulations from friends and colleagues who knew what this day meant to my career. But mixed among the supportive messages were texts from my family that reminded me that my achievement was still being viewed through the lens of their financial expectations. Congratulations on finishing school, my mother had written. Now we can talk seriously about Jessica's business opportunity. My father's message was more direct. Proud of you for getting your degree. When do you start making professor money? Jessica had sent a single text. Hope you're ready to help family now that you're done with your student phase. The disconnect between their messages and the reality of what I'd accomplished felt more stark than ever. I hadn't just finished school or completed a student phase. I had earned recognition as a researcher whose work was influencing educational policy at the national level. My teaching methods were being implemented in school districts across multiple states. I had become an expert in something that mattered, someone whose knowledge could benefit thousands of children over the course of my career. That evening, I called Grandpa Frank to share the news of my successful defense. His response was everything I'd hoped for from my family but hadn't received. Dr. Martinez, he said, testing out my new title with obvious pride. Your grandmother would have been so proud. She always knew you were going to do something important with your life. We talked for an hour about my research, about the job opportunities I was considering, about the impact my work might have on future students who struggled the way I had. Are you going to tell the rest of the family about the job offer from Northern Arizona University? He asked as our conversation was winding down. I hadn't mentioned Dr. Williams's interest to my parents, partly because I knew they would immediately calculate salary information and begin planning how my income should be allocated to family financial goals. I don't think they're interested in the details of my career, I said. They just want to know when I'll start earning enough money to fund Jessica's business ventures. Speaking the truth out loud to someone who understood the situation helped clarify how dysfunctional my family's response to my achievement had become. The next few days brought additional recognition that highlighted the gap between my professional success and my family's perception of my work. The Journal of Educational Psychology published an early online version of my research article, accompanied by an editorial praising its innovative approach and practical applications. The National Education Association issued a press release announcing their pilot program implementation, specifically mentioning my teaching methods as groundbreaking interventions for students with learning differences. But when I shared these developments with my family, their responses revealed how completely they misunderstood the significance of what was happening in my career. That's wonderful, honey, my mother said when I told her about the journal publication. But when will this start generating income? Jessica really needs that startup capital we discussed. My father's reaction was similarly focused on financial implications rather than professional recognition. The pressure intensified over the weekend when Jessica called with news that her business mentor had given her a deadline for securing funding. Sarah, I need to know by Monday whether you're going to help me or not. My mentor says that family investors are crucial for business credibility, and I've been telling potential clients that my sister is backing my skincare line. The revelation that she'd been promising my financial support to clients I'd never agreed to help felt like a new level of manipulation. Jessica, I never agreed to invest in your business. I just defended my dissertation 2 days ago, and I'm focused on pursuing academic positions. My words seemed to have no impact on her expectations, as if my actual career goals were irrelevant to her financial plans. Academic positions, she repeated dismissively. Sarah, you could make so much more money in the private sector. Why are you limiting yourself to teaching when you could be earning real money? Her question revealed how little she understood about the nature of academic research, about the satisfaction that comes from pursuing work that aligns with your values and expertise, rather than simply maximizing income. The conversation ended with Jessica's threat to handle the situation herself if I didn't commit to funding her business by Monday. I wasn't sure what that meant, but her tone suggested she was planning some kind of intervention that would force my compliance with their financial demands. Monday morning brought clarification of Jessica's threat in a way I hadn't anticipated. I received a call from Dr. Chen asking if I was available for an unexpected meeting with university administration. Sarah, there's been some kind of complaint filed against your research. I don't have details yet, but the graduate school wants to discuss it this afternoon. Her tone carried the kind of concern that made my stomach clench with anxiety. The meeting took place in the office of Dr. Patricia Gonzalez, the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies, a woman I'd met only briefly during orientation 6 years earlier. She greeted me with professional courtesy but obvious discomfort about whatever complaint had been filed. Dr. Chen accompanied me, her presence providing some reassurance in what felt like an increasingly surreal situation. Dr. Martinez, Dr. Gonzalez began, consulting a folder on her desk. We've received a complaint alleging that your dissertation research involved unethical data collection practices. Specifically, that you misrepresented your financial situation to gain access to low-income student populations for your study. The accusation was so unexpected and so completely false that I initially struggled to respond. I'm sorry, but I don't understand, I said finally. My research followed all IRB protocols, and I never misrepresented anything about my financial situation to participants or their families. The Institutional Review Board had approved my study design months ago, including detailed protocols for participant recruitment and data collection that ensured ethical treatment of all subjects. Dr. Chen spoke up, her voice reflecting the indignation I couldn't quite access yet. Patricia, Sarah's research has been exemplary throughout her graduate career. These allegations are completely inconsistent with everything I know about her work. She turned to me with a questioning expression. Sarah, do you have any idea where these complaints might be coming from? The realization hit me like a physical blow. Jessica's threat to, quote, handle this situation herself had apparently involved filing false complaints against my academic work, trying to sabotage my dissertation and career prospects in retaliation for my refusal to fund her business. The cruelty of attacking my professional reputation as punishment for not giving her money felt like a betrayal so complete that I couldn't immediately process its implications. I think these complaints are coming from my family, I said slowly, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. They've been pressuring me to use my future earning potential to fund my sister's business venture, and when I refused, my sister threatened to take action if I didn't change my mind. Speaking the words made the situation sound even more unbelievable than it felt. Dr. Gonzalez consulted her folder again, her expression growing more serious as she read through the documents. The complaint was filed by someone claiming to be a concerned family member who witnessed unethical behavior during your research. They've provided what appears to be detailed information about your study methodology and participant interactions. She looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and concern. Dr. Martinez, how would a family member have access to confidential research information? The question hung in the air as I tried to process the implications of what Jessica had done. She had somehow obtained information about my research, possibly from conversations I'd had at family gatherings, or from documents I'd left in my childhood bedroom during visits home. The idea that she would use private information about my academic work to file false complaints against my dissertation felt like a violation so profound that I struggled to find words to respond. My sister has been present during some conversations about my research, I said carefully. I may have discussed methodological challenges or participant recruitment during family dinners, thinking it was safe to share academic concerns with family members. The words felt inadequate to explain how my trust in family confidentiality had been weaponized against my professional reputation. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her protective instincts as my advisor clearly activated by the situation. Patricia, I've supervised Sarah's research from the beginning. Every aspect of her methodology was approved by the IRB, and I can personally vouch for her ethical conduct throughout the study. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades in academic research and understood the gravity of ethics violations. I understand your confidence in Dr. Martinez, Dr. Gonzalez replied. But these allegations are quite specific. The complainant claims that Sarah misrepresented her financial circumstances to gain sympathy from low-income families, encouraging them to participate in research under false pretenses. She consulted the folder again. They've also suggested that she used emotional manipulation to influence data collection, specifically targeting vulnerable families for personal gain. The accusations were so far from the reality of my research experience that they felt like descriptions of someone else's work entirely. My study had involved collaboration with 3 elementary schools serving diverse student populations, with careful attention to ensuring that participation was voluntary and beneficial for all involved students. The teaching methods I'd developed had actually helped participating children improve their reading skills, providing tangible benefits rather than exploitation. Dr. Gonzalez, I said, finding my voice despite the surreal nature of the conversation. I can provide documentation of every aspect of my research methodology. My IRB approval letters, participant consent forms, data collection protocols, school district collaboration agreements. Everything was conducted according to university ethical standards. The suggestion that I had manipulated vulnerable families for personal gain felt like such a fundamental misunderstanding of my research goals that I struggled to address it directly. The complainant also alleges that you've been dishonest about your living situation and financial circumstances throughout graduate school, Dr. Gonzalez continued. They suggest that you've received significant family financial support while claiming to be self-supporting, and that this misrepresentation affected your eligibility for need-based funding and research opportunities. This accusation was particularly cruel because it twisted the reality of my financial struggles into evidence of deception. I had indeed received minimal family support during graduate school, living in near poverty while working multiple jobs to fund my education and research. The idea that my genuine financial hardship was being reframed as fraudulent misrepresentation felt like attack on both my integrity and my lived experience. Dr. Chen's expression had shifted from concern to anger as she listened to the allegations. Patricia, these complaints sound like they're coming from someone who wants to sabotage Sarah's career rather than someone with legitimate ethical concerns. The level of detail suggests familiarity with her personal situation, but the accusations are completely inconsistent with the research I've observed and supervised. I agree that the situation is unusual, Dr. Gonzalez acknowledged, but we're required to investigate all ethics complaints thoroughly, regardless of their source or apparent motivation. Dr. Martinez, I'll need you to provide comprehensive documentation of your research methodology and financial circumstances during graduate school. We'll also need to contact participants from your study to verify that ethical protocols were followed. The meeting concluded with my agreement to compile evidence refuting the false allegations, but the damage to my emotional state was immediate and profound. Walking across campus after the meeting, I felt like I was seeing my academic environment through different eyes, wondering if other people had heard about the complaints, if my professional reputation was already being questioned by colleagues and faculty members. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by boxes of research documentation, preparing the materials that would prove my ethical conduct and financial circumstances. Bank statements showing years of minimal income, IRB approval letters demonstrating proper research protocols, participant feedback forms revealing the positive impact of my teaching methods on struggling students. The evidence of my integrity was extensive, but the fact that I needed to prove my honesty felt like a fundamental violation of the trust that academic communities depend on. My phone rang around 8 o'clock, displaying my mother's number. Against my better judgment, hoping that she might have called to apologize for Jessica's actions, I answered, "Sarah, we heard that you're having some problems at the university. Jessica is really sorry if her concerns about your research caused any trouble." The apology was delivered in my mother's characteristic tone of concern that somehow managed to sound like criticism. "Mom, Jessica filed false allegations against my dissertation research. She's trying to sabotage my academic career because I won't fund her business." Speaking the words aloud to my mother felt like translating between different languages, trying to explain the severity of academic ethics violations to someone who viewed my research as an expensive hobby rather than a professional commitment. "Honey, I'm sure Jessica was just trying to make sure everything was above board. She's concerned about your financial decisions, and maybe she thought the university should know about your situation." The suggestion that Jessica's false complaints were motivated by concern rather than retaliation felt like gaslighting so complete that I momentarily questioned my own understanding of what had happened. "My situation?" I repeated. "Mom, I've been living in poverty for 6 years while pursuing my doctorate. I've worked multiple jobs to support myself, lived on instant noodles and generic coffee, deferred medical care because I couldn't afford insurance. What exactly did Jessica think the university needed to know about my situation?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if my mother was finally grasping the reality of what I'd endured during graduate school. But when she spoke again, her words revealed how completely my family had misunderstood both my financial circumstances and the nature of academic work. "Sarah, you've always been dramatic about money. Jessica thinks you've been exaggerating your financial difficulties to gain sympathy and avoid family responsibilities." The accusation that I had fabricated years of genuine hardship felt like such a fundamental denial of my lived experience that I couldn't immediately respond. "I have bank statements proving every dollar I've earned and spent during graduate school," I said finally. "I have documentation of every job I've worked, every grant I've received, every expense I've deferred because I couldn't afford it. This isn't dramatics, Mom. This is documentation." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my mother alternating between defending Jessica's actions and suggesting that I was overreacting to what she characterized as family concern about your choices. By the time I hung up, I felt emotionally exhausted in a way that made preparing my ethics defense feel secondary to simply surviving the personal betrayal my family had orchestrated. The next morning brought an email from Dr. Williams at Northern Arizona University, asking if I was still interested in discussing the tenure track position. Her message was brief but enthusiastic. "Dr. Martinez, your research continues to generate excitement in our department. We'd like to schedule a formal interview within the next 2 weeks if you're available." The opportunity felt like a lifeline in the midst of the crisis my family had created around my academic career. I responded immediately, confirming my interest and availability for the interview process. Dr. Williams replied within hours, providing details about the position and outlining the interview schedule that would include presentations to faculty and graduate students, meetings with department administrators, and discussions about research collaboration opportunities. The professional tone and obvious respect for my work provided a stark contrast to my family's treatment of my academic achievements. That afternoon, I met with Dr. Chen to discuss the ethics investigation and my response to the false allegations. Her office felt like a refuge from the chaos my family had introduced into my academic life, a space where my research was valued and my integrity was assumed rather than questioned. "Sarah, I've been thinking about this situation overnight, and I want you to know that the department will support you completely throughout this investigation," she said as I settled into the familiar chair across from her desk. "Your research has been exemplary, your ethical conduct has been beyond reproach, and these allegations are clearly motivated by personal animosity rather than legitimate academic concerns." Her support meant everything to me, but it also highlighted how isolated I'd become within my own family. The people who should have been celebrating my academic achievements were instead actively sabotaging them, while colleagues and mentors who had known me for only a few years were willing to defend my character and professional integrity. "Dr. Chen, I'm worried about how this investigation might affect my job prospects," I admitted. "Even if the allegations are ultimately dismissed, The fact that ethics complaints were filed against my research might raise questions for potential employers. The academic job market was competitive enough without the added burden of defending against false accusations from family members. I understand your concern, but I don't think you need to worry about long-term impact, she reassured me. The investigation will reveal these complaints to be baseless, and your research record speaks for itself. The Northern Arizona University position is a perfect fit for your expertise, and Dr. Williams has already expressed strong interest in your work. We spent the next hour reviewing the documentation I'd compiled to refute the false allegations. Bank statements showing years of minimal income, work records from my various part-time jobs, IRB protocols demonstrating ethical research practices, participant feedback revealing the positive impact of my teaching methods. The evidence was comprehensive and convincing, but the process of compiling it felt like having to prove my innocence of crimes I'd never considered committing. That evening, I received a text from Jessica that revealed more about her motivations for filing the ethics complaints. Sarah, I'm not trying to hurt your career. I just think the university should know that you're not as poor as you pretend to be. Family should help family, and you're using fake poverty to avoid helping me. The message demonstrated such a complete misunderstanding of both my financial circumstances and the nature of ethics violations that I didn't know how to respond. I showed the text to Miguel during our shift at Desert Grounds the next morning, hoping that an outside perspective might help me understand how my refusal to fund Jessica's business had escalated into false accusations against my dissertation research. Miguel read the message twice, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. Sarah, this is insane, he said finally. She filed complaints against your research because you won't give her money for a business. And now she's defending it by saying you're not really poor enough to deserve sympathy? He shook his head as he prepared a customer's order. Your family has completely lost perspective on what normal behavior looks like. His reaction helped me see the situation more clearly, confirming that my family's behavior was as unreasonable as it felt from the inside. But it also highlighted how the people closest to me had become the primary obstacles to my professional success, creating crises that distracted from the work I'd spent 6 years developing. The ethics investigation continued over the next week, with Dr. Gonzalez interviewing participants from my research study and reviewing the extensive documentation I'd provided. Each day brought anxiety about potential damage to my professional reputation, but also growing confidence that the truth would eventually vindicate my conduct and methodology. Meanwhile, my family's pressure campaign intensified in ways I hadn't anticipated. Aunt Carol called to express concern about my attitude toward family obligations. Uncle Mike sent an email suggesting that I, quote, reconsider my priorities before burning bridges I might need later. And various cousins reached out with messages that seemed designed to make me feel guilty for pursuing my own career goals rather than funding Jessica's business ventures. The coordinated nature of their outreach suggested that my parents had been actively recruiting family members to their perspective, framing my refusal to fund Jessica's business as selfishness that required intervention. I wondered what version of events they had shared, whether they had mentioned the ethics complaints Jessica had filed or the false accusations she had made against my research. Friday afternoon brought the resolution I'd been hoping for but hadn't dared expect. Dr. Gonzalez called to schedule a meeting where she would share the results of the ethics investigation. Her tone was professional, but noticeably warmer than it had been during our previous conversation, suggesting that the investigation had reached conclusions favorable to my defense. Dr. Martinez, I'm pleased to inform you that our investigation has found no evidence to support the allegations that were filed against your research, she announced as soon as I sat down in her office. Your methodology was exemplary, your ethical conduct was beyond reproach, and the participants we interviewed spoke very highly of their experience in your study. The relief I felt was so profound that I momentarily struggled to respond. Weeks of anxiety about my professional reputation, about the potential impact on my career prospects, about the violation of trust within my own family, suddenly resolved into vindication and renewed confidence in my academic work. More importantly, Dr. Gonzalez continued, the investigation revealed that the complainant provided false information about their relationship to your research and misrepresented their knowledge of your financial circumstances. We're treating this as a malicious complaint filed in bad faith, and we'll be taking steps to prevent similar harassment in the future. The formal vindication felt like closure on one aspect of the crisis my family had created, but it also highlighted the extent to which they had been willing to go to punish me for refusing to fund Jessica's business. Filing false ethics complaints wasn't just manipulation or emotional pressure. It was an attempt to sabotage my career in retaliation for maintaining professional boundaries. That evening, I called Grandpa Frank to share the news of the investigation's resolution. His response was immediate relief, followed by anger at Jessica's actions that matched my own emotional journey through the crisis. "Sarah, I'm so sorry this happened to you," he said after I'd explained the week's events. "What Jessica did was wrong on every level. Filing false complaints against your academic work because you won't give her money for a business is..." He paused, apparently searching for words strong enough to capture his disapproval. "It's unforgivable. It's sabotage disguised as family concern." His validation meant everything to me, confirming that my family's behavior was as unreasonable as it felt, and that my response had been appropriate given the circumstances. But it also underscored how isolated I'd become within my extended family, with only my grandfather willing to acknowledge the severity of what had happened. "Are you going to tell your parents about the investigation results?" he asked. I hadn't decided whether to inform them that Jessica's complaints had been dismissed as malicious and false, whether to try once more to help them understand what they had allowed to happen, or whether to simply move forward with my career without attempting further family reconciliation. "I don't think it would change anything," I said finally. "They've made it clear that they see my academic achievements as obstacles to Jessica's financial goals rather than accomplishments worth celebrating. The investigation results won't change their fundamental perspective on my career choices." We talked for another hour about the Northern Arizona University interview, about my research publication in the Journal of Educational Psychology, about the pilot program implementation that was expanding my teaching methods into additional school districts. Grandpa Frank's enthusiasm for my professional success provided the kind of family support I'd hoped for from my parents. Recognition that my work mattered beyond its potential for generating income to fund other people's dreams. The weekend brought additional recognition that highlighted the contrast between my professional success and my family's dismissal of my achievements. The National Education Association published a feature article about innovative teaching methods for students with learning differences, prominently featuring my research and quoting extensively from my published work. The article described my teaching methods as revolutionary approaches that address the individual learning needs of struggling students, and positioned me as a leading voice in educational psychology research. I forwarded the article to Dr. Williams at Northern Arizona University, who responded enthusiastically about the additional evidence of my research impact. "Dr. Martinez, this article confirms everything we hoped about your potential contributions to our department. We're very much looking forward to your interview next week." Her message reinforced my sense that the academic community valued my work in ways my family couldn't understand or appreciate. Monday morning brought the interview invitation I'd been anticipating, but also a text from Jessica that revealed her continued failure to understand the severity of what she had done. "Sarah, I heard your university said my concerns were unfounded. I still think you're hiding money from the family, but I'm willing to forget about the research stuff if you'll help with my business." The message treated her false ethics complaints as a minor misunderstanding rather than a serious attempt to sabotage my career. I didn't respond to Jessica's text, instead focusing on preparing for the Northern Arizona University interview that represented everything I'd worked toward during 6 years of graduate study. The opportunity to join a faculty that valued educational psychology research, to continue developing teaching methods for struggling students, to build a career around work that aligned with my values and expertise, felt like validation of every sacrifice I'd made during my academic journey. The interview process took place over 2 days, involving presentations to faculty and graduate students, meetings with department administrators, discussions about research collaboration opportunities, and tours of facilities where I would potentially conduct future studies. Every interaction reinforced my sense that Northern Arizona University would provide the kind of academic environment where my research could flourish. Dr. Williams introduced me to faculty members who were already familiar with my published work, graduate students who expressed interest in participating in future research projects, and administrators who understood the practical applications of my teaching methods. The conversations felt like coming home to a community that valued the same educational goals I'd been pursuing throughout my doctoral studies. Dr. Martinez, your research addresses exactly the kind of educational challenges our department is committed to solving, Dr. Williams said during our final meeting. We're particularly impressed by the real-world implementation of your teaching methods and the measurable impact on student outcomes. This is the kind of work that changes lives. Her words captured something my family had never understood about my career choices. Academic research wasn't theoretical self-indulgence. It was practical problem-solving that could benefit thousands of children who struggled in traditional classroom settings. My teaching methods were already helping students across multiple states develop reading skills that had previously seemed beyond their reach. The job offer came 3 days after my campus visit, accompanied by a salary package that was modest but sufficient for comfortable living and continued research. More importantly, the position offered the opportunity to pursue work that mattered, to continue developing innovative teaching approaches, to mentor future educators who would carry these methods into classrooms across the country. When I called Dr. Chen to share the news, her excitement was infectious. "Sarah, this is perfect for you. Northern Arizona University has one of the strongest programs in the region, and they clearly understand the value of your research. You're going to do amazing work there." Her enthusiasm reminded me why I'd chosen to pursue academic research in the first place: the satisfaction that comes from contributing to knowledge that can improve other people's lives. That evening, I drafted an acceptance letter for the position, officially committing to the next phase of my career in educational psychology research. As I wrote about my excitement for joining the faculty and continuing my work on innovative teaching methods, I felt the kind of contentment that comes from aligning your professional choices with your deepest values and interests. But I also felt the weight of understanding that my family would likely view this job offer as vindication of their financial expectations rather than recognition of my academic achievements. They would see my salary as potential funding for Jessica's business ventures rather than compensation for years of preparation and expertise in educational psychology. The text from my mother that arrived as I finished my acceptance letter confirmed my predictions about their response. "Sarah, congratulations on getting a professor job. Now we can finally discuss how you're going to help Jessica get her skincare business started. Family comes first, and it's time for you to prove that." The message treated my career achievement as the resolution of their financial planning, rather than the culmination of my academic journey. I set my phone aside without responding, and looked around my tiny apartment, at the books and research papers that had sustained me through 6 years of graduate study, at the evidence of work that was already changing how teachers approached instruction for struggling students. Tomorrow, I would formally accept the Northern Arizona University position and begin planning my transition from doctoral student to faculty member. My family's inability to understand or support that transition didn't diminish its significance or my excitement about the opportunities ahead. The notification from my bank arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, 3 weeks after I'd started my new position at Northern Arizona University. "Unauthorized access attempt detected on your account. Please call immediately if you did not initiate this activity." The message sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in my new office. I called the bank's security department immediately, dreading what I might discover. "Dr. Martinez, we detected someone attempting to access your account using personal information that would typically only be available to family members," the security representative explained. "They had your social security number, mother's maiden name, and childhood address, but they couldn't answer security questions about your recent employment history." The attempted breach felt like another violation, another way my family was trying to access resources I'd never agreed to share. The representative continued with details that made my suspicions feel like certainties. "The person claimed to be calling on your behalf regarding a family emergency that required immediate access to your funds. When we asked for verification of your current employment status, they became agitated and hung up." I closed my eyes, imagining Jessica sitting in our parents' living room, surrounded by my childhood documents, trying to convince bank representatives that she had permission to access my accounts. I immediately implemented additional security measures on all my financial accounts, changed passwords, and added flags that would require in-person verification for any major transactions. The process of protecting myself from my own family felt surreal, like I was living in someone else's story rather than my own reality. That afternoon, I received a call from my department chair, Dr. Rebecca Williams, asking if I was available for an unexpected meeting. "Sarah, we've received some unusual inquiries about your employment here," she said, her tone carrying the kind of concern that suggested another crisis was developing. "Someone claiming to be a family member has been calling to verify your salary information and employment status." The meeting took place in Dr. Williams's office, the same space where I'd interviewed just months earlier with such optimism about my future in academic research. Now I found myself once again defending my integrity and explaining my family's escalating attempts to interfere with my professional life. The caller identified herself as your sister and claimed she needed salary verification for family financial planning purposes, Dr. Williams explained, consulting notes she'd apparently taken during the conversation. "When our administrative staff explained that we couldn't release employment information without your written authorization, she became quite insistent that family members should have access to such details. I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger, imagining Jessica calling my new employer and demanding access to private information about my compensation and employment status. The idea that she felt entitled to details about my salary for her own financial planning felt like such a fundamental violation of boundaries that I struggled to articulate my response. "Dr. Williams, I want to be completely transparent about my family situation," I said, deciding that honesty was preferable to allowing my colleagues to wonder about the motivations behind these inquiries. "My sister has been pressuring me to fund her business ventures, and when I declined, she's escalated to various forms of harassment, including filing false ethics complaints against my dissertation research." Dr. Williams' expression shifted from professional concern to personal sympathy as I explained the progression of family conflicts that had led to Jessica's attempts to access my bank accounts and employment information. Her response revealed both understanding of my situation and protective instincts about protecting the department from further disruption. "Sarah, I'm so sorry you're dealing with this kind of family pressure," she said when I finished explaining the scope of Jessica's interference. "Unfortunately, this isn't the first time we've seen family members try to exploit a faculty member's financial success. We'll make sure our administrative staff knows not to release any information about your employment to anyone without your explicit written permission." The conversation continued with Dr. Williams sharing resources about employee assistance programs and the legal protections against harassment, but also with reassurances that my family's behavior wouldn't affect my standing within the department. "Your research speaks for itself, and your teaching evaluations have been excellent. Don't let family dysfunction distract you from the important work you're doing here." Walking back to my office, I felt a mixture of gratitude for my colleagues' support and exhaustion from the ongoing need to defend myself against my family's escalating demands. The work I loved, the research that was helping struggling students across the country, kept getting overshadowed by crises created by people who should have been celebrating my achievements. That evening, I received a call from Grandpa Frank that provided context for Jessica's increasingly desperate attempts to access my financial information. "Sarah, I thought you should know that your parents took out a loan to fund Jessica's skincare business," he said without preamble. "They used the house as collateral, and now they're facing monthly payments they can't afford on your father's income alone." The news hit me like a physical blow. My parents had borrowed against their home to fund Jessica's unproven business venture, apparently assuming that my new faculty salary would be available to help with loan payments. The financial pressure they'd created for themselves explained the escalating intensity of their demands on my income. "How much did they borrow?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Grandpa Frank was quiet for a moment, apparently consulting information he'd gathered about their financial situation. $50,000, he said finally. Jessica convinced them that her skincare line would generate enough profit to pay back the loan within 2 years. But so far she's sold maybe a few $100s worth of products to friends and family members. The gap between Jessica's projections and her actual sales performance suggested that my parents were facing a financial crisis that could threaten their home ownership. "They're expecting you to help with the loan payments," Grandpa Frank continued. "Your mother has been telling neighbors that her daughter's professor's salary will solve their financial problems. They've essentially bet their house on Jessica's business and your willingness to bail them out." The revelation reframed all of my family's recent behavior, from the initial demands for financial support to Jessica's attempts to access my bank accounts and employment information. They weren't just pressuring me to fund a startup. They were facing potential foreclosure if Jessica's business failed, and I refused to help with loan payments. But understanding their financial desperation didn't make their demands more reasonable or their harassment more acceptable. If anything, it highlighted how poor their decision-making had become, how they had created a crisis by assuming control over my income without my consent or even my knowledge. Grandpa, I can't take responsibility for their choice to borrow money for Jessica's business, I said, though the words felt harsh even as I spoke them. I never agreed to fund her ventures, and I certainly never consented to being financially responsible for loans they took out without consulting me. I know, Sarah, and I'm not asking you to bail them out, he reassured me. I just thought you should understand why the pressure has intensified. They're scared, and scared people don't always make rational decisions about how to solve their problems. We talked for another hour about the situation, about my new position at the university, about the research projects I was developing with my graduate students. Grandpa Frank's ability to see both my parents' fear and the unreasonableness of their expectations helped me maintain perspective on a situation that felt increasingly surreal. The next morning brought a text from my mother that confirmed Grandpa Frank's information, while revealing how completely my parents had misunderstood both my financial obligations and my professional priorities. Sarah, we need to talk about helping with some unexpected expenses. Family business is struggling, and we could use your professor's salary to get through this rough patch. The euphemistic language about unexpected expenses and family business obscured the reality that they had voluntarily borrowed $50,000 to fund Jessica's unproven skincare venture, and were now expecting me to assume responsibility for their financial choices. The casual reference to your professor's salary as a family resource rather than my personal income revealed how they viewed my career achievements primarily as funding sources for their own goals. I didn't respond to my mother's text, instead focusing on preparing for a research meeting with my graduate students. My work at Northern Arizona University involved mentoring future educators who would implement innovative teaching methods in their own classrooms, continuing to expand the impact of research I'd developed during my doctoral studies. The meeting focused on a new study we were designing to test multisensory teaching approaches with middle school students who had been identified as struggling readers. My graduate students brought enthusiasm and fresh perspectives to the research, helping me see new applications for methods I'd been developing for years. Dr. Martinez, your teaching approach helped my nephew last summer when his parents couldn't afford reading tutoring, said Maria, one of my first-year graduate students. He went from barely reading at a second-grade level to tackling chapter books by the end of vacation. These methods really work. Her personal testimonial reminded me why I'd chosen to pursue educational psychology research, the satisfaction that comes from seeing struggling students discover their own capabilities. After the meeting, I returned to my office to find a voicemail from my father that made my academic achievements feel secondary to family crisis management once again. Sarah, this is Dad. We really need to discuss your financial contributions to the family. Things have gotten complicated with some business investments, and we're counting on your support to get through this situation. The voicemail's formal tone suggested he was trying to frame their loan payments as legitimate family obligations, rather than consequences of poor financial decisions made without my input. The phrase business investments made Jessica's skincare venture sound more substantial than the few $100s in sales she'd actually generated. I saved the voicemail without returning the call, instead opening my laptop to review research proposals for the upcoming semester. My work involved developing teacher training programs that would help educators across the region implement multisensory learning approaches in their own classrooms, expanding the impact of my research beyond the students I could reach directly. The irony of my situation wasn't lost on me. While my family dismissed my career as impractical academic work that interfered with real family responsibilities, I was actually engaged in research that would benefit thousands of children over the course of my career. The teaching methods I'd developed were already being implemented in school districts across 7 states, helping struggling readers develop skills that traditional instruction had failed to provide. That weekend brought the confrontation I'd been dreading, but had begun to recognize as inevitable. My parents and Jessica arrived at my apartment Saturday morning without warning, apparently having obtained my address from university records or public information databases. The unexpected visit felt like an invasion of the professional sanctuary I'd tried to create. "Sarah, we need to talk," my father said when I opened the door, his tone carrying the authority he'd always used when delivering family ultimatums. "We've driven 3 hours to have this conversation, and we're not leaving until we resolve this situation." Behind him, my mother and Jessica stood with expressions that suggested they had prepared for a lengthy confrontation. Against my better judgment, I invited them inside my small faculty apartment, immediately regretting the decision as they arranged themselves around my living room like they were conducting a family intervention. Jessica carried a folder that appeared to contain business documents, while my parents had brought what looked like loan paperwork and financial statements. "Sarah, we're facing a serious financial crisis," my mother began, her tone mixing desperation with the familiar guilt-inducing techniques she'd perfected over the years. "We took out a loan to help Jessica launch her business, and now we need your assistance to manage the monthly payments until her sales pick up." The admission that they needed help with loan payments rather than initial startup funding revealed how much more serious their financial situation had become. They weren't asking for a one-time investment in Jessica's business. They were asking for ongoing financial support to prevent potential foreclosure on their home. Jessica opened her folder and spread business documents across my coffee table, including sales projections that bore no relationship to her actual performance and marketing plans that seemed designed more to impress family members than to generate real customer interest. "Sarah, my business is just getting started, but the potential is enormous. I just need time to build my customer base." The gap between Jessica's optimistic projections and the reality of her minimal sales suggested that my parents' loan was unlikely to be repaid through business profits. Her skincare products had been available for 6 months, with virtually no market penetration, but she continued to present expansion plans that required additional investment rather than realistic assessments of current performance. "How much are the monthly loan payments?" I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. My father consulted the paperwork he'd brought, apparently calculating figures that would justify their expectations of my financial support. $800 a month for the next 7 years, he said. "We can manage part of that from my shop income, but we need your help with the difference. As a professor, you're making good money now, and family should help family during difficult times." The assumption that my faculty salary was available for their loan payments felt like such a fundamental misunderstanding of both my financial obligations and my professional independence. My modest academic salary was sufficient for comfortable living and continued research, but it wasn't large enough to absorb ongoing loan payments for business ventures I'd never agreed to support. More importantly, taking responsibility for their financial choices would establish a precedent that could continue indefinitely as Jessica pursued additional entrepreneurial projects. "I can't help with loan payments for a business I never agreed to invest in," I said carefully, trying to maintain calm despite the emotional pressure of the confrontation. "You made financial decisions without consulting me, and I can't become responsible for the consequences of those choices." Jessica's response revealed how completely she had internalized our parents' entitlement to my income and their dismissal of my professional goals. "Sarah, you're being incredibly selfish. We're family, and family helps each other during hard times. You have a good job now, and you should be grateful for the family support that helped you get there." The accusation of selfishness for refusing to fund loan payments for someone else's business felt like such a distortion of reasonable family expectations that I struggled to respond effectively. My graduate school years had been funded entirely through my own work and merit-based aid, with minimal family support, despite my repeated requests for help with basic expenses. "What family support helped me get this job?" I asked. "You discouraged my graduate education, dismissed my research as impractical, filed false ethics complaints against my dissertation, and tried to access my bank accounts without permission. How exactly did any of that contribute to my academic success?" The silence that followed my question suggested that even my parents recognized the contradiction between their claims of support and their actual behavior throughout my academic career. But rather than acknowledging their lack of encouragement, they shifted to emotional manipulation tactics that had been effective during my childhood. "Sarah, we raised you," my mother said, her voice taking on the wounded tone that had always made me feel guilty for asserting my own needs. "We provided a home, food, clothing, everything you needed to become successful. Don't you think you owe us something in return for that investment?" The framing of parental responsibilities as investments that created debt obligations felt like such a fundamental misunderstanding of family relationships that I couldn't immediately articulate my response. Parents choose to have children and assume responsibility for their basic needs. Children don't accumulate debt through the normal process of being raised. Mom, providing basic care for your children isn't an investment that creates financial obligations, I said finally. You chose to have kids, and that meant accepting responsibility for our needs during childhood. I don't owe you repayment for receiving the care that every child deserves. The conversation continued for nearly 3 hours, with my family alternating between emotional appeals about family loyalty and practical arguments about their financial desperation. But their fundamental position remained unchanged. My academic success created obligations to fund their poor financial decisions, and my refusal to do so represented betrayal of family values. We're not leaving until you agree to help, Jessica said as the afternoon wore on, her tone suggesting she was prepared to continue the confrontation indefinitely. I've worked too hard building this business to watch it fail because my sister won't share her professor money. The threat to remain in my apartment until I agreed to their financial demands felt like hostage-taking disguised as family discussion. More importantly, Jessica's claim to have worked hard building this business ignored the reality that her skincare venture had generated virtually no sales despite months of effort. You need to leave, I said, standing up and moving toward the door. I'm not agreeing to fund loan payments for a business I never supported, and continuing this conversation isn't going to change my position. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, like I was speaking a foreign language my family couldn't understand. My father's response revealed how completely they had misunderstood both my personality and my financial situation. Sarah, you're making a mistake that you'll regret for the rest of your life. Family is all you have, and you're choosing money over the people who love you. The implication that maintaining professional boundaries was choosing money over family distorted the reality of what I was protecting. I wasn't prioritizing money over family relationships. I was protecting my ability to continue research that helped struggling students while refusing to enable poor financial decisions that would likely require ongoing support. Taking responsibility for their loan payments would establish expectations for future financial rescues whenever Jessica's business ventures failed. After my family finally left, I sat in my apartment trying to process the emotional aftermath of the confrontation. The people who had raised me, who should have been proud of my academic achievements, had spent 3 hours demanding that I sacrifice my financial security for business ventures I'd never agreed to support. The next morning brought a text from Jessica that suggested our conversation hadn't resolved anything from her perspective. Sarah, I can't believe you're willing to let mom and dad lose their house just because you're too selfish to help family. This is going to destroy our relationships forever. The message framed potential foreclosure as my responsibility rather than the consequence of their own financial choices. I forwarded Jessica's text to Grandpa Frank, who called within an hour to discuss the situation and offer perspective on my family's escalating demands. Sarah, what they're asking isn't reasonable, and their threats about destroying relationships are manipulation tactics, he said. You didn't create their financial crisis, and you're not responsible for solving it. His support helped me maintain clarity about the situation, but it also highlighted how isolated I'd become within my extended family. With the exception of Grandpa Frank, everyone seemed to accept my parents' version of events, in which my refusal to fund Jessica's business represented selfishness that threatened family unity. 2 weeks later, I received a call that changed the trajectory of the entire conflict in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dr. Patricia Chen, my former dissertation advisor, called with news about an opportunity that would expand my research impact beyond anything I'd previously imagined. Sarah, I have incredible news, she said, her excitement evident even through the phone. The Department of Education wants to fund a national implementation of your teaching methods. They're offering a 3-year grant that would allow you to train teachers across the entire Southwest region. The opportunity represented validation of my research at the federal level, recognition that my work was significant enough to warrant large-scale government funding. The grant would provide resources to establish teacher training programs at multiple universities, to develop curriculum materials for widespread distribution, to conduct longitudinal studies measuring the impact of multisensory teaching approaches on student outcomes across diverse populations. It was the kind of career-defining opportunity that most academic researchers only dream about receiving. The funding amount is substantial, Dr. Chen continued. Nearly $2 million over 3 years. with opportunities for renewal based on measurable outcomes. Sarah, this grant could establish you as the leading researcher in your field, while helping thousands of children develop reading skills they might never acquire through traditional instruction. After our conversation, I sat in my office looking out at the campus where I'd built my new career, trying to process the magnitude of what Dr. Chen had described. A federal grant of this scope would not only validate my research, but provide resources to expand its impact far beyond what I could achieve through individual university programs. That evening, I called Grandpa Frank to share the news about the grant opportunity. His response was immediate pride and excitement about my professional success, the kind of family support I'd hoped for from my parents throughout my academic journey. Dr. Martinez, with a federal research grant, he said, testing out the title that would accompany this new phase of my career. Your grandmother would have been so proud. She always knew you were going to do important work that would help other people. His words reminded me why I'd chosen to pursue educational psychology research, the satisfaction that comes from using personal struggles to benefit others facing similar challenges. Are you going to tell your parents about the grant? He asked as our conversation was winding down. I hadn't decided whether to share news about the federal funding, knowing that they would immediately calculate the financial implications and begin planning how the additional resources should be allocated to family needs rather than research expenses. I don't think they would understand the significance beyond the funding amount, I said. They see my career primarily as a source of income for family financial goals, rather than as research that benefits struggling students. The disconnect between their perception of my work and its actual impact felt more stark than ever, given the scale of recognition the federal grant represented. A month later, my family's financial situation reached a crisis point that forced the confrontation I'd been anticipating since learning about their loan. My mother called with news that made their desperation impossible to ignore any longer. Sarah, we've received a foreclosure notice, she said without preamble, her voice carrying the kind of panic that suggested their situation had become genuinely dire. We have 60 days to bring the loan payments current, or we'll lose the house. We need your help immediately, or your father and I will be homeless. The foreclosure notice confirmed that their financial crisis was real rather than manipulative exaggeration, but it also highlighted how their poor decision-making had created consequences that threatened their basic housing security. Borrowing $50,000 against their home to fund Jessica's unproven business venture had been irresponsible financial planning that I couldn't retroactively validate through emergency funding. Mom, I'm sorry you're facing foreclosure, but I can't take responsibility for loan payments I never agreed to support, I said, trying to maintain compassion for their fear while holding firm boundaries about my financial obligations. You made borrowing decisions without consulting me, and I can't become liable for those choices now. The conversation that followed revealed how completely my family had convinced themselves that my academic success created automatic financial obligations to solve their problems. They had apparently assumed that my faculty salary and research grants were family resources rather than professional compensation for work that benefited struggling students nationwide. Sarah, you have federal grant money now, my mother said, apparently having learned about the Department of Education funding through family gossip networks. Surely you can spare enough to help us avoid foreclosure. Families should stick together during emergencies. The suggestion that I should divert federal research funds to personal family financial problems demonstrated such a fundamental misunderstanding of grant administration that I struggled to respond. Mom, federal grants can only be used for approved research expenses, I explained. Using grant money for personal financial assistance would be fraud that could end my career and result in criminal charges. The funding is designated specifically for educational research, not family financial support. But even explaining the legal restrictions on grant funds didn't seem to diminish their expectations of my financial assistance. They had apparently decided that my professional success, regardless of its specific nature or limitations, should be available to solve family financial crises that resulted from their own poor planning. The foreclosure situation continued to escalate over the following weeks, with increasingly frantic calls from family members who seemed to believe that my refusal to help was unreasonable selfishness rather than appropriate professional boundaries. Jessica's business had generated virtually no additional sales, making it clear that loan repayment through business profits was unrealistic. 3 weeks before the foreclosure deadline, I received a call from Dr. Williams, that brought the family crisis into my professional environment once again. Sarah, someone has been contacting our administration claiming that you've been misusing federal grant funds for personal expenses, she said, her tone mixing concern with confusion about the allegations. The accusation felt like another attempt by my family to pressure my compliance with their financial demands, this time by threatening my professional reputation and federal research funding. Jessica had apparently escalated from filing false ethics complaints against my dissertation to making allegations about grant fraud, apparently hoping that professional consequences would force my cooperation. Dr. Williams, these allegations are completely false, I said immediately. I've been scrupulous about grant administration, and all research expenses have been properly documented and approved through university procedures. The suggestion that I had misused federal funds felt like such a serious professional attack that I struggled to remain calm while discussing it. I believe you completely, Dr. Williams reassured me. The allegations came from someone who couldn't provide any specific evidence of wrongdoing, and your grant administration has been exemplary. But I wanted you to know that someone is making these accusations so you can take appropriate action to protect yourself. After our conversation, I realized that my family's harassment had crossed into territory that could genuinely threaten my career and research funding. False allegations about federal grant misuse were serious enough to trigger investigations that could disrupt my work, even if they ultimately proved baseless. That afternoon, I made the decision I'd been avoiding for months. I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in harassment cases, explaining the progression of my family's demands and the escalating nature of their attempts to interfere with my professional life. Dr. Martinez, what you're describing constitutes a pattern of harassment that could justify restraining orders, the lawyer said after reviewing documentation of Jessica's false complaints and my family's repeated attempts to access my financial information. Your family members are using increasingly serious allegations to pressure your compliance with financial demands, which creates legal liability for them and professional risk for you. The lawyer's perspective helped me understand that my family's behavior had moved beyond inappropriate pressure into territory that could be addressed through legal intervention. Filing false reports about ethics violations and grant fraud weren't just manipulation tactics, they were potentially criminal activities that could result in serious consequences for both my family and my career. 2 days before the foreclosure deadline, my family made one final attempt to pressure my financial support through a confrontation that revealed how desperate their situation had become. They arrived at my office during scheduled research hours, creating a scene that attracted attention from colleagues and graduate students. Sarah, this is your last chance to do the right thing, my father said when I met them in the hallway outside my office, his voice loud enough to be heard by people working in adjacent spaces. We're going to lose our house tomorrow if you don't help, and that will be your fault for choosing selfishness over family. The public confrontation in my workplace felt like such a violation of professional boundaries that I immediately called campus security, rather than attempting to negotiate with them privately. My colleagues and students were watching a family drama unfold in an academic setting, which created exactly the kind of professional embarrassment I'd been trying to avoid throughout this entire conflict. Ma'am, you need to leave university property immediately, the security officer said when he arrived to assess the situation. This is a workplace, and you're disrupting academic activities. My family's removal from campus by security guards felt like the final breakdown of any possibility for reconciliation or compromise. That evening, I received a text from Jessica that confirmed my understanding of how completely our relationships had deteriorated. Sarah, Mom and Dad lost the house today. I hope you're happy with what your selfishness has accomplished. Don't ever contact any of us again. The message blamed me for consequences that resulted from their own financial choices, while simultaneously cutting off family relationships that had become more harmful than supportive. The next morning brought a call from Grandpa Frank with news that provided context for the previous day's events. Sarah, your parents didn't actually lose the house, he said. They worked out a loan modification with the bank that extends their payment schedule and reduces the monthly amounts. They're going to be fine financially, but they wanted you to think they'd lost everything. The revelation that their foreclosure crisis had been resolved through bank negotiations, rather than family assistance, highlighted how my parents had been using manufactured emergency situations to pressure my financial compliance. They had apparently assumed that the threat of homelessness would overcome my professional boundaries and force me to provide funding for their poor financial decisions. They're telling everyone in the family that you abandoned them during their greatest time of need, Grandpa Frank continued. But the truth is that they created their own financial problems and tried to make you responsible for solving them. You made the right choice by maintaining your boundaries. His validation meant everything to me, confirming that my response to their pressure had been reasonable, despite the family conflict it had created. I had protected my ability to continue research that helped struggling students, while refusing to enable financial irresponsibility that would likely have required ongoing support. 6 months later, my federal research grant had been approved and implemented, establishing teacher training programs at 5 universities across the Southwest region. My multisensory teaching methods were being used in over 200 classrooms, helping thousands of children develop reading skills that traditional instruction had failed to provide. The recognition my work was receiving provided perspective on my family's dismissal of my career achievements. While they had viewed my research as impractical academic work that interfered with family financial goals, the educational community was implementing my teaching methods on a scale that would benefit struggling students for generations. I still received occasional messages from family members expressing disappointment about my selfishness during their financial crisis, but the emotional impact of their disapproval had diminished significantly. I had built a career around work that aligned with my values and expertise, surrounded myself with colleagues who understood the significance of educational psychology research, and established professional relationships that provided the kind of support I'd hoped for from family. Grandpa Frank continued to visit regularly, celebrating my research achievements and understanding the importance of work that helped children who struggled the way I had struggled. His support reminded me that family relationships should enhance rather than diminish personal growth and professional success. My small faculty apartment had been replaced by a house with space for a home office where I could continue developing innovative teaching approaches. The quiet sanctuary I'd created was filled with research materials, grant proposals, and correspondence from teachers who were implementing my methods in their own classrooms. The federal grant had provided resources to establish myself as a leading researcher in educational psychology, while helping thousands of children develop reading skills they might never have acquired through traditional instruction. My work was making a measurable difference in the lives of struggling students, validating every sacrifice I'd made during my academic journey. Most importantly, I had learned that family loyalty doesn't require sacrificing professional goals or enabling poor financial decisions made by people who refuse to accept responsibility for their own choices. Real family support enhances individual success rather than demanding its sacrifice for collective financial goals. The research that had begun as personal response to my own learning struggles had evolved into work that was changing how teachers approached instruction for diverse learners nationwide. Every child who benefited from multisensory teaching methods validated my decision to pursue academic research despite family pressure to abandon it for more immediately profitable alternatives. Looking back on the family conflicts that had consumed so much emotional energy during my early career, I felt grateful for the clarity that had emerged from defending my professional boundaries. The people who should have been celebrating my achievements had instead tried to exploit them for their own financial benefit, but their inability to understand the value of my work didn't diminish its impact on struggling students across the country. My PhD certificate hangs in my office now, next to the federal grant award and letters from teachers whose students have benefited from my research. The recognition represents more than personal achievement. It validates work that continues helping children who struggle with traditional learning approaches discover their own capabilities and potential for academic success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.